Good morning, everyone. Welcome. Thank you so much for being here bang on 9 a.m. Very impressive turnout. You've struggled through the traffic. We'll have more to say about traffic in a little bit. I'm James Cockayne. I'm the New South Wales Anti-Slavery Commissioner, and you're in the session on addressing modern slavery and achieving remedy through meaningful worker voice. What have we learned? So if this isn't the room you're meant to be in, you're welcome now to relocate, but we're very happy to have you all. We have a great panel for you this morning. To my right, your left, we have Ninh Woot Yi, who is the director of the Labour Rights Foundation, a migrant worker-led organisation based in Thailand that protects and promotes migrant workers' rights by empowering them through awareness raising, complaints handling and strengthening collective voice. Mark Taylor is the Senior Director, Strategy and Global Partnerships at the ISRA Institute, a non-profit organisation focused on combating human trafficking and promoting ethical practices in global supply chains. He's lived and worked in Southeast Asia for over 20 years. And Professor Justine Nolan is Director of the Australian Human Rights Institute and a Professor in the Faculty of Law and Justice at UNSW Sydney. She's published widely on business and human rights and modern slavery and advises companies, NGOs and governments on these issues. Justine is also a member of the Australian Government's Modern Slavery Expert Advisory Group. And as I said, I'm James Cockayne. I'm the New South Wales Anti-Slavery Commissioner. For those of you who don't know, New South Wales is a state in the Federation of Australia, the Commonwealth of Australia. It's actually the 8th largest economy in Asia, New South Wales alone. And the New South Wales government is the largest single employer in the Southern Hemisphere. Annually, public entities in New South Wales spend more than $35 billion US on goods and services. And for the last 2 years, they've had mandatory modern slavery due diligence obligations that align with the UN guiding principles on business and human rights. And so one of my roles, amongst others, is to help more than 420 public entities figure out how to take reasonable steps to identify and address modern slavery risks and to remedy modern slavery harms. I should make clear I don't speak for the New South Wales government, and I certainly don't speak for the Australian government. I'm appointed by government, but I'm an independent statutory officer. I report to the Parliament of New South Wales. So since I came into that role a couple of years ago, I heard 3 questions very frequently. Public sector agencies in my state are fairly new to the concepts of business and human rights. So the first question they asked was, why should we engage workers directly? How is that our job? What do we get out of it? What do they get out of it? Secondly, what does that look like? And thirdly, how exactly do we do that in our particular context? So I wanted to just say a little bit about the why, the what and the how before we come to panel members to hear about their practical experiences on the ground. And I was thinking about the why last night while I was sitting in Bangkok traffic, in one of those lovely traffic jams that I think locals probably know all too well. And I was struck by the fact that nobody was using their horn. Nobody was beeping, despite how long it was taking. And this compare this to traffic jams in many other places where people are very much expressing their frustration. I used to live in New York. Anyone who's been through traffic jams in New York or Jersey knows they're very quick to be on their horn. They're very quick to use their voice. And I was talking to Salil Tripathi, who some of you will know. We were speculating on who would be the next Nobel Prize winner. And I was reminded actually of a story about someone who never won a Nobel Prize, but everybody says should have, a German economist called Albert Hirschman. Albert Hirschman is the source of the concept of voice that we're talking about here today. He was sitting in a traffic jam in New Jersey and wondering how people chose to exit, to leave the traffic jam, take an off-ramp, to express their voice, to lean on the horn, or did they just stay loyal to what they'd committed to, sit there quietly, patiently in the traffic jam? And he wrote a book in 1970 called Exit, Voice and Loyalty that is the source of this idea that you have to have voice within an organisation to be able to express your concerns, or you're forced to either exit or you're forced into loyalty, which, as we know, leads to all sorts of problems in the long run. Now, if you as a worker cannot exit, which is often the case for many workers in supply chains that we're talking about here today, and you have no voice, then all you are left with is enforced loyalty, and you're storing up those problems for the longer run. in the organization and in the organizations that perhaps you're selling to. So that idea of voice is really critical, not only from the perspective of the business, but also critical for understanding the risk to people. And I think it's really central that we come back to that point, that what we're all about here, and the reason that Remedy is so important, is to reduce risk to people across the system, and not just the risk to the individual organisation. We hear a lot about worker voice in terms of it helps the business understand where its risks are and manage or avoid them. But actually the overall public purpose here is to reduce collective risk across the system, not just to shuffle it around from one company to another. So hearing directly from workers or indirectly from workers through trusted intermediaries is really critical. And that brings us to the what. We often think about, or we see companies thinking about worker voice in two stages in their procurement and other business activities. The first is at the beginning, when they're trying to do a risk analysis. And the second is, if I can put it this way, at the end, when things have gone wrong. But actually, worker voice is critical all the way through, in every step of the business decision-making cycle, if we can call it that, in order to build that trust and to avoid an extractive relationship with workers, to actually ensure that there's a co-creation of value. So I think we'll hear a bit more today about how worker voice is critical to Remedy, but actually needs to be built on the foundations of a relationship that's been built through the due diligence process, through risk identification, and in particular at the contract management stage. Which brings us to the how. A colleague of mine, Sarah, who is a survivor of modern slavery, likes to point out that for many survivors, Remedy is relational. What's often been lost is a sense of trust in organisations, and rebuilding that trust can only come through the development of a relationship. Worker voice that is focused on extractive or transactional approaches, we will give you this, perhaps even money in return for you giving us your data, risk not building that longer-term relationship that allows Remedy to be achieved effectively. So what we're going to do now is turn to our three panellists who have so many years of experience thinking about what this actually looks like on the ground. And I'm going to begin with Hnin. Thank you so much for joining us here, Hnin. As I said, Hnin is the director of the Labour Rights Foundation, which does this work of patiently building trust with migrant workers, particularly from Myanmar, to identify key issues and complaints. So Hnin, why do you think that empowering migrant workers in particular is important in supply chains rather than just focusing on the end of filing complaints and seeking remedy once the harm has already occurred?
Thanks a lot for inviting me to this distinguished panel. In our experience, grievance mechanisms at factory level is rarely effective. Workers are at risk of being retaliated if they raise their concerns individually. Even if they're not retaliated, their issues get ignored most of the time. Hence, it's important that workers get empowered and united to make collective demand to improve their working conditions. It's important that they are connected to other like-minded associations and organizations such as CSOs, NGOs, national and regional workers' unions and associations. LRF, Labour Rights Foundation, we helped strengthens capacity of migrant workers solidarity community, MWSC. MWSC consists of migrant workers from both formal and informal sectors, mainly from seafood sector, but members also include from electronic sector and heavy industry sectors, members from the informal sector such as agriculture workers, and fishing boat workers also include in MWSC network. We raise their awareness about labor laws and labor rights. We do advocacy in collaboration with MWSC and other partners to encourage Thai government to protect and promote migrant workers' rights. We also provide social and paralegal assistance to individual workers whose rights have been violated. However, we encourage workers to raise their concerns collectively. For instance, one of our female MWSC member led her co-worker at a seafood factory to ask their manager to install a cooling system. It was around in April with excessive heat, with no adequate fans at their department. They hardly work properly. So she organized her co-workers, and about 100 of them went to their manager and asked to install a cooling system. The management positively responded and fixed their issues. In another case, LRF, in collaboration with our partner organization, helped facilitate the negotiation between affected workers at a seafood factory and their employer. Workers' visa expire after their 4 years of work in Thailand. In fact, Thai government allowed these workers to renew their visa via the cross-border U-turn process since early January this year. However, the factory didn't manage properly to help these workers get their work permits in time. Hence, workers who can't go home in Myanmar due to conflicts in their hometowns are forced to resign after their work permit expire. Hence, they lost their job and their legal status. They also didn't get any compensation. Hence, we helped them document their cases and their co-worker cases, and we facilitate them to submit their demand letter to their employers and hold a couple of meetings between the employer and a group of workers. The process is still going on, but their employer promised that they will compensate these workers. And also, since then, next subsequent batches of their co-workers nowadays can renew their visa using a cross-border U-turn process after their 4 years work permit. So these are a few examples that how workers' collective demand can really achieve some remedy. But there are, of course, a lot of challenges. Maybe I'll tell later about challenges, maybe.
Why don't you go on, Hnin, while it's fresh in your mind, please?
Sure.
What are some of the challenges you've seen?
So I mean, a lot of challenges, especially this time around for Myanmar migrant workers. You know, as you know, without effective collaboration between the home country and the host country to improve policy and practices for the migrant workers' rights protection and promotion, migrant workers face a lot of struggles, and migrant workers are being exploited in various aspects. I just give like one example. Due to the country conflict situation and conscription law, many youths and middle-aged men left for Thailand, and they lack documents and get exploited by their employers. They get much lower pay than the minimum wage, but they dare not lodge complaints, they dare not raise their voice because of their legal status. And also under 120-day legal status, a lot of undocumented workers, police raid the employment businesses and the employment sites, construction sites, and a lot of undocumented Myanmar migrant workers have been arrested and deported back to country. So some of these issues are beyond the capacity of organization, civil societies, even though we are trying hard to advocate more for the migrant workers' rights. And but for the, as I explained, like existing workers who have documents, they can raise more voices, but even that workers nowadays feel very scared because they tend to put up with the situation they face if they think that these are the minors compared with the being risks of losing jobs and being sent back home. Okay, thank you.
Thanks so much, Nin. So I take at least two things from what you've just said. That the first is the importance of collective voice, that voices raised together may be more effective in achieving remedy than individuals raising their voices alone. But the second point is highlighted by the challenges you were just discussing, that even that power of collective voice exists in a particular regulatory and legal context. There may be limits on that, so there's also a role for government in determining the framework that allows individuals who may be at risk of harm to work collectively. Now, another aspect that we've seen a lot of discussion of in recent years is the key role that technology can play in helping individuals and groups of workers use voice. If they can't exit, if they're not happy with the loyalty option, coming back to that ability, it's like giving them a horn to lean on in a way. Mark Taylor from ISRA Institute has been involved in the development of an inclusive labour monitoring community dashboard, which ISRA describes as a sandbox for sharing and amplifying worker voices by aggregating data from worker voice channels. But you've also worked to wrap around that engagement with particular communities, or perhaps it's better to say that's embedded in the dashboard. Can you tell us a bit more about your experiences with the dashboard and how it goes beyond data collection to changing practices of large companies?
Great. Thank you very much, and it's a pleasure to be here on this panel and with you all this morning. So first I'll talk a little bit about ILM and then talk about some of the changes that we're seeing. So inclusive labor monitoring, ILM, essentially is a worker voice-centered tech system and a multi-stakeholder collaboration platform. So the aim here is to provide ongoing monitoring of conditions in supply chains across industries that covers both countries from where workers come from and where they go to work. So really it's bringing together a real mix of stakeholders. So it includes NGOs, it includes suppliers, it includes recruitment agencies, brands and retailers. And even the public. And this was sort of the aim of having that sandbox and having, workervoices.org, www.workervoices.org, is the location to go ahead and amplify, for the public in what we think is really a pretty groundbreaking and systematic way where you can drive more ethical supply chains and engage meaningfully with workers and civil society. So if you have a chance to go ahead and take a look on that site, you can basically see and interact with the data that comes from basically, as you mentioned, the anonymized and aggregated information of dozens of civil society organizations working here in the region. So essentially the network that is being built out has primarily to date focused on Thailand, on Malaysia, and Japan, but also from sending countries, from Myanmar, from Cambodia, Nepal, and then we're currently basically expanding, growing out to Indonesia, Taiwan, and India. So this network and this system is growing where you can bring together civil society. And one of the things that does is it enables a common monitoring framework that can elevate the voices of workers and basically elevate that out in the public domain. So as of right now, this group, this network of civil society, which is NGOs and trade unions coming together, it's generating about 10 to 20,000 calls and messages from workers per month. So we're getting some real volumes in terms of understanding what the realities are for workers across different industries, across different corridors. And over the last 3 years combined, that's resulted in over 145,000 workers being supported in remediation. And so, those are some pretty big numbers, and the question often comes up is what makes that successful? What is happening here? And the reality is, it's uncovering a lot of issues that just haven't been detected through existing methods. And there's been a lot of conversations, here at the forum and in other events just around social audits. And so, this is where, for a different approach, the words inclusive and monitoring become so important. And it's inclusive because it's reflecting the ongoing feedback of workers, not just point in time, but also the actions and responses of suppliers and recruiters. And so to receive that ongoing feedback from workers that is inclusive and that provides real reliable data, I want to underscore that reliable component, workers and communities must trust you. As I think, James, you mentioned, the element of trust in the beginning. And so trust for this ILM network really comes in part because it's done by civil society in terms of that engagement, direct engagement with workers. Civil society has basically a duty of care to act upon the information that they receive. They're already present and working in the communities of workers. So it's not just one central hotline number, it's not some one tech tool to go ahead and rule them all, but it's really how can we uplift and support what workers already trust and what's already working effectively on the ground. So this includes, organizations that are able to better risk assess the situations that's changing constantly, such as in Myanmar and other different environments. It's about being able to empower those workers and those individuals with information so they can choose and be better informed about what steps they want to take. And it's providing safeguards as well, as we're talking about different remedial actions. And that really takes a sustained presence on the ground for monitoring. And it's not going to disappear for those workers when a global buyer basically stops sourcing from a particular site.
Thanks, Mark. So again, this idea of trust and having a trusted third party as a way to intermediate the conversation between the worker and the company that may be the source of harm or risk emerges is really important. And am I taking it correctly from what you've said that you think that social audits have a limited ability to build trust with the worker? Is that because they are episodic, they're not having an ongoing relationship, they don't have a duty of care in the same way you described with NGOs on the ground?
It's different. I think the expectations of what can be achieved through a social audit that's point in time, that has, limited ability to be engaging with workers, and that trust is not going to be, as strong as I think, some of the other established networks that are on the ground. And I think that leads to the question you'd asked earlier about some of the change as well. So you'd mentioned change in large businesses or large companies, and there's often that focus on global brands and retailers, but I think this really extends much broader. So it includes government procurement practices, it includes to suppliers, to SMEs, upstream, tier 2, 3, and 4. It includes to recruitment agencies as well. So essentially, what we've seen in terms of changing practices, we've seen is providing, this network and this data, as you see on workervoices.org, it's able to connect these players together, that you can raise transparency and accountability in data that you just hadn't seen before. It's identifying and detecting issues that were not being detected before. So this provides more reliable data and insights from brand new sources, and that enables business and stakeholders to act upon it. And you see this from the remediation as well too. So if you can hear about issues that you didn't have an awareness before, you now can address them. You can get the validation as well in terms of how effective the remediation is directly from workers. That strengthens companies and businesses' systems. That better data can lead to better analysis and addressing root causes. And if you're a business and you're investing time and money to go ahead and try to make improvements, you want to just not be reacting constantly. You want to be in a place where that information can help really address some of those root causes so you can be proactive and preventative in the first place. So these all together, I think we're seeing some real benefits in the broader ecosystem, especially from recruitment. But it comes down to if you want to, you need to hear from workers to be able to address this.
So what I take from that is you're describing a more systemic response and how these kinds of tools and approaches can enable a more systemic response, and how worker voice is so essential to allowing us to see risk across the system and engage more systemically in response and remedy. And that brings us back, I think, to the original why that we were discussing, that the point here is not only to remedy individual harms, but to try and actually reduce risk across the system as a whole. Now, Justine, we heard from Henin earlier that that's all well and good, that approach, but it is fundamentally shaped by regulatory context and regulatory initiatives and what kind of collective voice governments will allow, for example. We see some really important emerging regulatory initiatives around reporting and due diligence around the world. A number of them have been discussed in the last day already. Do you think that they are driving in a direction that will support or undermine worker voice and the kinds of approaches that Hanine and Mark have been talking about?
It's a great question and probably too early to come to a definitive opinion on that. But I think the first thing to think about is that it's actually not a new idea to engage workers in monitoring and to engage workers, those people who are most impacted. The ILO has been around for more than 100 years, and the idea is based on the fact that you want to have workers empowered to be able to speak up, both individually and collectively. So these new laws that are coming into play now are sort of, playing catch up with that concept in many senses. I think it's, we sort of get tied up in it. The how is the hard part. It's not rocket science that we should involve workers in getting feedback on their conditions. That should just be by now a no-brainer. The difficult part is to think about how you can do it well. I think we've had plenty of practice in the last few decades of how you can do it badly. And so the challenge now is to think about, we've got some new laws that are going to potentially give us a framework to make a more structured approach. And so how do we actually engage with them and make the most of this? And I think it comes down to both what Hanine and Mark have talked about, is that there is a relationship approach, a relational approach to building trust with workers. That technology definitely has a role to play here. But you've got to build that trust with workers. So a couple of examples that we've been looking at over the last couple of years have been companies that have been trying to do this, even predating these laws that have coming in. So one example we've been looking at is the sourcing of rubber in Brazil, where a company took about 5 years to build a relationship of trust with a worker cooperative. And this cooperative was both the sort of a business body and a worker voice angle for the rubber tappers in Brazil, who were directly involved in negotiating pay rates and how they were being paid. And that has led to this very successful model. Another example from Australia is an organisation called the Cleaning Accountability Framework, which involves a union and involves the workers in that monitoring process. And there's sort of a co-designed approach between both the workers and the businesses as to how that approach is going. So it's the idea that, really that you can't get caught up that there's going to be one easy solution. And that you're going to have to try different things, and that you have to understand, in order to build worker voice, you're going to have to involve, governments have to be involved, business have to be involved, civil society, and most importantly, workers need to be in that mix. So I think the new laws that are coming out actually do have the potential to really develop more meaningful stakeholder engagement. But like with any law, there's always an opportunity to sideswipe it and take the easy approach, and to really just, tick that box and say done. And that I think we have to think about, what is the difference between consulting with someone and engaging with them. And the engagement process of workers is dynamic. It continues on. It's not a one-off job. A consultation might be, let's meet you, hear your views, and we move on and we do as we push. The idea of these new laws is that there's going to be meaningful stakeholder engagement. But that is time and money to make it work well.
And it's power, isn't it, as well? Because what you're saying is it's not an extractive approach where the company comes to the worker, asks for their views, thank you very much, we'll take them away, we'll make the decisions. But it's actually inviting workers to be involved in the development of business models, the adjustment of business models to reduce risk over time, and then monitoring of that. Is that right, that it's also about sharing power in a certain way?
Yeah, which can feel scary and risky for some, but actually, for business, it's actually a huge advantage, because you're actually getting a much higher level of intel about how you can be more efficient in your workplace, how your workers can be, better cared for, which tend to be, they may stay longer. So I think there's ways of looking at it as both an opportunity as a challenge. I think there'll be many sort of legal counsel in companies who'll see these new laws and will be encouraging people to draw back, be encouraging companies potentially to be less transparent about what they're doing and to take less risks. If they're going to be done well, the idea is that you would actually embrace that risk and de-risk it in essence by bringing the workers into the fold and getting better intel about how you can operate.
That brings us a little bit back to the regulatory question. How do we scale that kind of approach? That approach that you're describing is about building relationships, which, as you said, is a very time-consuming and resource-intensive and quite localised kind of approach. we often hear this question, how do we scale worker voice? And sometimes the answer that's offered is through technology that has the ability to offer the kind of networking effects that Mark was talking about. How do you see the regulation pushing us in the direction of certain approaches to scaling and sustainability?
Scaling is definitely a challenge, and the reality is that it can't also be done quickly, and we have to recognise that. Technology is useful there, but as Mark noted, you've got to have technology plus trust, and that's the element that takes time. But it's also starting to think about what other different models can we use, and how are companies doing it differently. Some of the really successful ones, if you look at the dairy cooperative throughout India, Amul, you have thousands, tens of thousands of workers who have built this system from the ground up as a cooperative, who are basically a really key part in designing that process. That is a massive scale. That is actually a very, very successful business venture. So sometimes we have to think a little bit outside the box. We've always done this sort of, one-off, let's go, one factory, let's audit that, and then let's do a pilot project, and then let's see how we go. Sometimes we just have to think, let's just go for it. Let's really try this at scale, invest in it. Some of the companies we've been talking to have just decided to change their approach and integrate it in rather than start with a, 300 or 1,000 workers in one factory. But it is risky, but sometimes then we know that the current system we have is not working. And so we have to think outside the box.
Great. So just as the drive to reduce carbon emissions is getting us to rethink business models and think about a more circular approach, maybe the drive to reduce the externality of labour harms is also going to force us to think about an adjustment to business models. Can I ask the wonderful technicians if they could bring up the slide deck, please? Because it's time for us to come to all of you. We know there's a lot of expertise in the room. You're probably still in the process of ingesting some caffeine or absorbing caffeine that you've had already. But we're going to give you an opportunity now to talk amongst yourselves for 5 minutes. If we could just please bring up the slides so that we can show the audience the question that we want to put to you. So this wonderful question designed by Justine is, we'd like you to turn to the person next to you and just have a little bit of a chat for 5 minutes. We'll give you a proper 5 minutes to think this through. What are 1 or 2 critical steps that companies can take to enhance collaboration with worker organisations and strengthen worker voice? What have you seen? What do you think is working in this area? And then we'll ask for a few brave volunteers perhaps afterwards to share anything particularly important or insightful that they have learned from their conversation with their neighbour. If you're watching on at home, feel free to drop something in a chat or send an email in, and then we'll come back, gather those thoughts, and then come to a more open Q&A. We would like to make this a bit more interactive and give us the chance to learn also from all your wonderful expertise. So we'll start now. Please turn to the person next to you or behind you. If you don't know them, great chance to introduce yourself, and we'll call you back to order with this gavel in about 5 minutes. All right, thank you everyone. Great to hear the wonderful conversations going on. We're going to call you all back together now. This is what happens when you encourage people to engage in voice, huh? We're going to bring you back for a collective, larger scale conversation now to try and benefit from the wisdom that's just been generated. We're going to begin with, I sat in on a very interesting conversation, and I'm going to voluntel Tony Craw from NXP Semiconductors and his colleague or his neighbor Balan. I was listening to a very interesting conversation they were having about trust and how you build it. Would one of you be so kind as to get the ball rolling, and then we'll happily open the floor to volunteers who'd like to share from their conversation. I have 3 other panelists who are also capable of voluntelling people to participate, but Tony, Balan, would one of you like to take the floor? Thank you.
Yeah, I've been chosen as a spokesperson. So, good morning, everyone. I'm Tony Call from NXP Semiconductors. So Bala and I had a good conversation about this, and so I think if you look at the relationship, traditionally the relationship between a worker organization and the business, there's always that distrust, right? So I think the first critical step is to, to build that trust, to build that bridge, to have that conversation. I was just telling James about. We do have a factory here in Bangkok, and we do have a labor union, and so we do have collective bargaining agreement once every 2 years, and there was a worker strike. That was quite many years ago, and when we were trying to reduce the number of working hours for the workers, and the workers were not happy because, of course they want to work more hours and earn more money, but the reason we want to do that is, of course, we want to protect the health and well-being of the workers, right? Not to have them overwork, but to ensure that we also compensate them with regards to less working hours. We need to align their salary. So the conversation was difficult beginning because there's a big gap between what the workers want and what management would like them to have in terms of their working hours. But at the end of the day, through this difficult conversation, we can close the gap, we can build the bridge to the workers. I think the critical steps is to build the trust and to have that conversation and to align expectations between both parties, right? So I think there's always, it's always important to really sit down and have that conversation. So I think that's key, yeah. Thanks
you so much, Tony. Can I just ask you a follow-up there? Because it sounds like you didn't just have a conversation, you actually engaged in a genuine good faith negotiation.
Correct.
And closed the gap, not just by building a rhetorical bridge, but actually moving closer and aligning your compensation expectations, it sounds like.
Correct, yeah.
Okay, so some kind of compromise might actually be involved now and then.
Yeah.
Great.
Correct. Yeah.
Thank you for getting the ball rolling. Very, very helpful. Are there any brave volunteers who'd like to share any pearls of wisdom? Yes, sir. I see you at the back there. And I'm very keen to see female voices as well. We know that if you give the floor, as I failed to a woman first, women are 40% more likely to participate in the subsequent conversation. So I'm very keen to see female volunteers, please. But, sir?
Thank you very much for this floor for me to show some issues as well as the solution from our discussion at the moment with our colleagues here. Actually, we also have noticed that there are 4 points worth to notice about the collaboration at workplace with employers as well as the industrial relation. For example, related to the trust building, it's very important for all of us to do. When we have trust, everything we could do because we believe each other, then the relationship will be happening as well. And the second, we just like to show about the communication between the communication with employers and workers should be related to each other as well. If there is no good communication, how can we build trust or build industrial relation at the workplace? And the third one is solution. Solution is also important for all of us to practice at the workplace as well. If there is no solution, how can we find an improvement as well as the industrial relation, how to improve the working condition for workers and employers as in the past levels as well. And the last one is also feedback and also improvement. The last one is very important because we'd like to get more information from the other stakeholders, especially when we have something implemented wrongly or districtly from any parts of the principles or guidance, or especially about the social dialogue or about the OS as well. So we need to get all this information and try to improve or adjust this one for improvement for the plan level or for the enterprise level for all stakeholders to accept this way as well. Thank you very much. Okay.
Thank you so much, sir. And just also for trust building purposes, could you just share with us your name and the organization that you're speaking from?
Oh, I'm sorry. Yeah. Let me introduce myself. My name is Priap Muniswan. I'm from Collective Union of Women Workers from Cambodia. And I really feel excited to show my feeling today as well. And I just want to get more information from the other stakeholders as well as from the participants in these rooms as well. Thank you for this honor opportunity to me from the floor, especially about the moderator and also the panelists. Thank you.
Not at all, thank you. And a great summary, I think, from you. Trust, communication, solutions, and feedback. I think that's a wonderful. Yes, ma'am, over here. Thank you.
Hi, so I'm Zuleika, I'm from Malaysia. I represent a financial institution. We are a regional bank, but specifically talking about the Malaysian office, there's two things that I think that do work. When we talk about trust with your bosses, I think it's a lot harder than, say, trusting a union. So in a Malaysian office, anyone below assistant managers and below are automatically included into a labor union. And in this way, from the start, you're not sort of like figuring out what are the channels or who do I talk to, you automatically know who to talk to. And our unions are quite strong, so in that matter, funny enough, I actually have my increment percentage is way higher than my boss, as well as my leave. So on that front, I think we're really good with the union part. On the second part is there's multiple channels that you can go through. And I think this is important because people might not really be comfortable with one channel. So you have your physical one, you have your email ones, and if you're not comfortable with going to group human resource, then you can go straight directly to the CEO as well as the chairman. There's multiple ways to do that. But everything goes back to one central control room because like it or not, the change makers are also the same types of people. So I think having a diverse channel for a diverse workforce to sort of go through is also quite important. Thank you.
Wonderful. So two really interesting points there, that the kind of regulatory or normative framework that means that you're automatically included in a union is actually empowering, and comes back to this point that Justine was exploring about the role of governments and indeed companies in mandating that. And then options, giving people options so they actually have some agency is really important. I think I saw another hand over here. Yes, please, ma'am.
Hi, I'm Dr. Archana, and I represent Change Alliance India. And I had with me Benny from Hong Kong from private sector, and also Yen from IOM. So we have discussed about two things that's very critical. One is, I think, recognizing the collective and build and empower the diverse group of workers is very important, and support them to have open dialogue. Second is related to creating neutral and safe space, having transparency and non-retaliation on workers' voice and concern. And sometimes it is very important even to listen to them and listen to their concerns. And most of them, if you listen to or hear them, half of the problems get resolved. So I think that, and the group, workers' group should not be planted by the suppliers or the factories. Rather, it should be a diverse group and independent group who can talk about and raise their concerns.
Thank you. So collective approaches and diversity, safety in particular, you're stressing there, very helpful. Thank you. We have about 10 minutes to go. So I'm going to keep taking volunteers, but also invite, if you have a question for the panel, please also now feel free to raise your hand. And if we see you, we'll acknowledge you and give you that opportunity to put a question to the panel. Yes, sir.
My name is Sarvesh Ramakrishnan, representing the University of Tulsa in the USA as an undergraduate medical entrepreneurship student. I kind of spoke on like a different approach of business, particularly in healthcare in the US. So as a pre-med student, I've had the chance to understand the struggles of medical residents in the United States, a profession that's extremely underpaid and schedules even exceeding 24 hours per shift. It's a systematic issue and not a single corporate matter. So what do you suggest we should do to ensure that medical residents voice themselves to be adequately paid for their expertise, despite being seen as lower than full-time practicing doctors? Thank you.
Thank you. Anybody on the panel want to come to that question, which I think is indicative of situations where the harm is caused not necessarily by an individual company, as you're saying, but by structural forces? Is that a question, Justine, of companies creating and using leverage to influence government policy?
Yeah, I mean, that's obviously not a situation that is unique to the United States. It's, you know, it is common to that particular profession and that level of service that is going on. And that is indicative of the structural problem. The advantage that you have, I guess, is that you're in a very well-educated workforce with people who are generally not shy about expressing their voice, but at the same time very wary about their career path being managed by those above them if they do so. And I think in that situation, it really is this combination of both business and regulation that you need in order to have better conditions. Because the law won't solve the issue by itself, but at least if you can point to stronger standards that are not being enforced with it. But yeah, I mean, if we knew the solution to that, then I think residents around the world wouldn't be in the same situation as you. But I think you have an advantage over some in that you can't, what I think would be the strongest path there is a more collaborative approach, not one hospital at a time, one university at a time, but you actually need it to be a much more stronger national and global movement around that.
Yes, ma'am, at the back there.
Good morning, everyone. Svetlana Zenz, Article 19. I'm actually working on tech sector and civil society engagement. And you would think like, why is she talking now? But I'm talking because we are living in the future. You know, like I'm sure everyone here has at least one cell phone. And at least somebody once or twice or even more tried some social media using as well. And migrant workers are not exclusion here. So my question here is to the board is that how much do you involve tech sector in amplifying voices of migrant workers to raise the issues? And are they digitally protected from this perspective? And also heads up on UN Cybercrime Convention, which is going to be published soon, which is also will cover everyone when it will be enforced in terms of sharing data between the countries, and some countries which don't really have appropriate legal support and safeguards in terms of protecting rights holders, which is at the end, all of us. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Svetlana. I think Mark will respond to your question.
Great, thank you for the question. You know, on workervoices.org, if you can see the call volumes, it's broken down by the different worker voice channels. And so we've really seen that there's a combination to be effective of high tech and low tech. But the realities are that more and more young migrant workers have smartphones, they are on social media, this is their preferred way of communications. So for example, we see a high volume through Facebook is one of the key ways, because this is also how workers are communicating back home with families and with others. But Line, Viber, Telegraph, your traditional hotlines, there's a number of different ways that workers can engage. The challenge that comes up, I think, is in organizations and civil society and others are helping to inform and to make sure people know, workers particularly know, that what they post, you know, that can actually be held against them. There's some real risk in terms of what information they share, to be very cautious and careful about using their names and certain, you know, and from that PII perspective. So we see, you know, there's a lot of work that needs to be done, I think, in terms of strengthening, getting information out to individuals that are well-intentioned, but actually maybe bringing more risk upon themselves. And then also, you know, there are initiatives that are taking place, and, you know, the ILM network has benefited from, you know, collaborations through Tech Against Trafficking, where we're working closely with Microsoft, with AWS and others, you know, Golden Dreams, which is a component of this, just received an award from MIT Solve and so on. So there's really good initiatives that are out there that are trying to work with the grassroots to help strengthen and build better practices in that digital environment. But a lot of risk too, and we see recruitment agencies and others, scammers trying to take advantage of the situation. So it's an ongoing effort, I think, to address this.
For organizations like LRF, we are engaged with workers on daily basis. We are working on ground. So our staff, senior worker organizer, always engage with the mainstream media, and also we post workers' issues on social media, and also interview with the mainstream media. And also for MWSC, we have the social media Facebook group, and we always engage with these workers through the social media group, exchange the information regarding the updated news and policy and laws related to the migration. But as Mark said, for workers themselves to raise their issues on media, social media is quite risky for them, for their safety. But for organizations like LRF can amplify their voices. Thank you.
Thanks so much, both of you. I think we have time for one last question, and then last comments from the panel.
Yeah.
So, sir, yes.
Thank you. Myself, Johnson Topino. I represent a civil society organization called FIA Foundation, and we work with the indigenous communities and migration. And what we have seen is that when there is a peak, we used to get around more than 7,000 to 8,000 calls per day. We run a helpline within the country, India, and we have seen that, the companies, the business enterprise, they try to make, they don't want to get it registered in the regulatory mechanisms which is established, and they want to avoid because of the profit or profit maximization and so on. But what I would like to say is that if we have a robust grievance redressal mechanisms, we would be able to address, but it cannot be done in isolation. We need a government to be there, and reinforcement is very, very important to ensure that human rights are not violated, their wages are protected, compensation are being given, and that should not be limited within the country, but across the border we should have some mechanisms wherein we will be able to make safe and responsible migration more robust. Thank you.
Thank you.
Sorry to interrupt. The lady at the right really wanted to say, sorry, just we will give the floor.
সবাইকে শুভ সকাল আমি উর্মি আক্তার বাংলাদেশ থেকে আসছি
So this is Urmi Akhtar. She is from Bangladesh, and due to her language barrier, I'm going to ask your permission to translate for her. I hope it's all right with you all. Thank you very much.
হোপলন অ্যাপারেল লিমিটেড সম্মিলিত শ্রমিক ইউনিয়নের প্রেসিডেন্ট আমার ফ্যাক্টরিতে 7,000 শ্রমিক ওইখানে আমি ট্রেড ইউনিয়নের সভাপতি
She is the president of Hoplun Apparels Limited, Shammalito Shromik Union. She is representing the trade union of 7,000 workers.
তো আমার কারখানায় আমি ট্রেড ইউনিয়ন অনেক সংগ্রাম যুদ্ধের মাধ্যমে করি 2018 সালে ওইখান থেকে আজ 6 ইয়ার রানিং ট্রেড ইউনিয়ন চলতেছে
So she started her journey in 2018, and after 6 years, the trade union is now blooming.
তো এই ট্রেড 7,000 শ্রমিকের মধ্যে আমার ফ্যাক্টরিতে চাঁদা দেয় 10 টাকা করে 50,000 টাকা চাঁদা ওঠে প্রত্যেক মাসে এবং মালিক শ্রমিকের মধ্যে সুসম্পর্ক থাকবে যদি মালিক মিড লেভেল ম্যানেজমেন্টের সাথে যোগাযোগ না করে সরাসরি শ্রমিকের সাথে যোগাযোগ করে সেক্ষেত্রে মালিক সরাসরি তথ্য জানতে পারবে শ্রমিকের পাশে দাঁড়াতে পারবে
So what our message is that if the owners talk to the management without keeping any gap with the workers, that can really build the bridge between workers and the management, because in Bangladesh, there is a lack of freedom of association and collective bargaining agreements, though her factory has done collective bargaining agreements for 2 times. So what she wants to convey is that mending that bridge, that communication gap between the owners and the workers is really important to ensure a decent working condition. That's all.
Thank you.
Thank you. Well, I think that's a great place for us to wrap up in respect of everybody's time, summarising the really, or demonstrating the importance that everybody has placed on collective voice, on the building of trust, of the fact that it requires an investment by companies of time and effort to build those bridges, to maintain effective communication, to listen, and then actually to engage in safe, practical solutions to the problems that are identified through these various channels, whether they are unions, other trusted intermediaries such as SNIN is involved in, or ISARA Institute, technical and technological-based solutions. Clearly, all of these are ways to give workers more power to have their grievances heard and to enable companies working with governments to put in place effective remedy for both individual harms and at a structural level. So please join me in thanking the panel for this wonderful conversation.